Welcome to a new episode of the Vault of History. Tonight, we drift into the past, not with legends of gunfights or gold rushes, but with quiet steps across the vast, windswept plains of the American frontier in the 1870s. A world far, removed from myth, shaped by silence, by dust, by the turning of seasons, and by the quiet endurance of those who lived it. Let the weight of the day fall away, breathe slowly, and let us drift together into a time when life moved not by clocks, but by sunlight, when survival was not a given, but a daily act of will, when the sky stretched endlessly above, and every decision carried consequence. The new day dawns on the frontier, and you've somehow survived the night of victory in itself in the Wild West. As you rub the sleep from your eyes and stretch your aching muscles, you contemplate what direction your frontier experience might take today. Perhaps you'll try your luck in one of the booming mining towns where fortunes are supposedly made overnight. You've heard stories of the California gold rush, the Nevada silver strikes, and the Colorado mining booms. Tales of ordinary men finding nuggets the size of chicken eggs and becoming wealthy overnight have drawn hundreds of thousands west. What these stories don't mention are the brutal realities awaiting those who chase mineral dreams. Let's say you decide to try your hand at mining. What would that actually entail? First, you'd need to stake a claim finding unclaimed land with potential mineral deposits, increasingly difficult by the 1870s as the easiest and richest areas were claimed years earlier. If you were lucky enough to find a promising spot, you'd need to register your claim at the nearest government office and pay the required fees, which could be substantial. Then the real work would begin, and it was some of the most physically demanding labor imaginable. For placer mining, searching for loose gold in streams, you'd spend hours bent over in ice-cold mountain water, sifting through sediment with a pan or sluice box. Your hands would crack and bleed from constant exposure to water and rough materials. Your back would ache from the hunched position. And after all that effort, you'd be lucky to find a few tiny flakes of gold worth pennies. If you ventured into hard rock mining, digging for veins of ore in the mountains, the dangers multiplied exponentially. Tunneling into unstable rock without modern safety equipment or engineering knowledge led to frequent cave-ins that crushed miners where they stood. Poorly ventilated shafts filled with toxic gases like carbon monoxide odorless, but deadly suffocated miners who had no warning of the danger. Blasting with black powder or dynamite to break through rock was incredibly hazardous. Miners frequently lost fingers, hands, eyes, or lives when charges detonated prematurely, or thrown rock fragments became deadly projectiles. The thunderous noise and constant percussion of blasting left many with permanent hearing loss, even if you avoided immediate catastrophes. The long-term health effects were devastating. Miners constantly inhaled fine rock dust, leading to silicosis, a painful lung disease that slowly suffocated its victims. Mercury used in gold processing caused neurological damage, tremors, and mental deterioration. Those working in copper or lead mines absorbed toxic metals that accumulated in their bodies, causing chronic illness and early death. The mining industry of the 1870s had virtually no safety regulations or oversight. Mine owners prioritized profit over worker welfare, and injuries were considered an expected part of the job. Medical care for injured miners was minimal and often ineffective. A serious injury typically meant the end of a miner's career and livelihood, with no disability support or workers' compensation available. For all these risks and hardships, what was the likely reward? Despite the mythology of the lucky prospector, the vast majority of miners barely earned subsistence wages. By the 1870s, most worked for large mining companies rather than independently, earning $2 to $3 for a grueling 10 to 12 hour day. Studies suggest that storekeepers, saloon owners, and prostitutes consistently made more money than the miners whose dreams sustained frontier mining towns. Speaking of mining towns, they were notoriously rough places. Imagine a community composed primarily of young, single men engaged in dangerous work, with few women, families, or civilizing institutions. Alcohol consumption was astronomical. The average mining camp resident consumed several times more alcohol than the typical American today. Violence was commonplace, with fights, stabbings, and shootings occurring regularly. Sanitation in mining camps was typically abysmal. With minimal planning or infrastructure, human waste and garbage accumulated in streets and waterways. Typhoid, cholera, and dysentery spread rapidly in these conditions. During warm months, the stench could be overwhelming, and swarms of flies spread disease from waste to food. If you managed to find valuable ore, you faced the challenge of converting it to cash. Banking in the Wild West was primitive and often predatory. Many mining towns had no banks at all, forcing miners to carry gold dust or ore, making them targets for theft. Some saloons and general stores offered to buy gold, but frequently at rates far below actual value, taking advantage of miners' limited options. Where banks did exist, they operated with minimal regulation or oversight. Bank failures were common, often wiping out customers' life savings without warning or recourse. Many bankers were little more than confidence men who established storefronts, collected deposits, and disappeared overnight with all the funds. Without federally backed currency, paper money was issued by individual banks, and its value fluctuated wildly depending on the bank's reputation. Counterfeit bills circulated widely, and even experienced merchants could be fooled by well-made fakes. The safest form of money was gold or silver coin, but carrying it made one a target for robbery. Perhaps, after considering the dangers and disappointments of mining, you decide to try your hand at ranching instead. The cattle industry was booming. In the 1870s, with demand for beef in eastern cities creating opportunities on the frontier, surely this would be a healthier, more profitable venture. Ranching did indeed avoid some of the worst health hazards of mining, but it introduced its own unique dangers and hardships. Starting a ranch required significant capital. Land, livestock, equipment, and buildings all represented major investments. Many aspiring ranchers went deeply into debt purchasing these necessities, betting their future on favorable weather and market conditions. Nature often had other plans. Droughts could wither grazing lands and dry up crucial water sources, forcing ranchers to either watch their cattle starve or sell at devastating losses. Harsh winters could kill entire herds, as happened in the infamous Great Die-Up of 1886 to 87, when up to 90% of cattle on northern ranges froze or starved to death during unusually severe weather. Disease could sweep through herds, wiping out a rancher's investment overnight. Texas fever, anthrax, and other infectious diseases had no effective treatments in the 1870s. Predators like wolves and cougars took a constant toll on livestock, particularly vulnerable calves. Poisonous plants, quicksand, and injuries further reduced herds. The iconic cattle drives moving herds hundreds of miles to railroad. Shipping points were not romantic adventures, but grueling, dangerous undertakings. Cowboys, not the glamorous figures of later films, but typically young, poorly paid laborers, worked 20-hour days during drives, catching brief naps in the saddle as they moved thousands of animals across difficult terrain. These drives faced constant threats. River crossings could turn deadly in minutes if animals panicked, creating deadly pileups that drowned cattle and cowboys alike. Stampedes, which could be triggered by something as simple as a lightning strike or a snapping twig, turned thousands of 1,500-pound animals into an unstoppable destructive force. Cowboys caught in stampedes were often trampled to death. The cowboys, Life was far from the freedom portrayed in Western mythology. They typically earned about $30 per month for exhausting, dangerous work. Most were very young men, often teenagers, from poor backgrounds with few other options. A significant percentage were Black, Mexican, or mixed-race individuals facing discrimination that limited their opportunities elsewhere. Their diet on the trail consisted mainly of beans, salt pork, and biscuits, with minimal fresh food. Medical care was limited to whatever the trail cook might know about folk remedies. Injuries, common in such dangerous work, often went untreated until they became life-threatening. Many cowboys died young from injuries, exposure, or violence. Perhaps ranching doesn't appeal after all, or maybe you consider farming. Surely growing food, the most fundamental of human activities, would offer a more stable and less dangerous way of life on the frontier. The Homestead Act of 1862 had opened vast areas of the West to settlement, offering 160 acres free to anyone who would live on and improve the land for 5 years. This seemed like an incredible opportunity, a chance for people with little money to become landowners and build independent livelihoods. The reality proved far more challenging than the promised at first. 160 acres might sound substantial, but in the arid regions that comprised much of the available land, it was often insufficient to support a family. Traditional Eastern farming methods failed in these environments, where rainfall was a fraction of what pioneers were accustomed to. Many settlers had no knowledge of dry farming techniques needed for success in these regions. Starting a frontier farm required tremendous physical labor. The first task was building shelter, typically a sod house on the treeless plains, constructed by cutting and stacking dense prairie turf. These soddies were dark, damp dwellings that leaked when it rained, harbored insects and snakes, and crumbled without constant maintenance. Then came the backbreaking work of breaking the land for planting. Prairie sod, held together by dense grass roots that had developed over centuries, was extraordinarily difficult to plow with the equipment available to most settlers. It could take a year or more just to prepare a few acres for planting. The work was so physically demanding that it permanently damaged many farmers' bodies. Once crops were planted, farmers faced threats from every direction. Drought could wither plants before harvest. Torrential rains could wash away seedlings or flood fields. Early frost could kill crops just before harvest. Grasshoppers descended in biblical swarms, consuming everything green in their path, and sometimes even eating the handles of tools left in fields. Disease affected frontier farmers as it did everyone else, but with particularly devastating consequences. With no hired help and little community support, a family's illness during crucial planting or harvesting periods could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Women often continued working the fields while heavily pregnant or just days after giving birth, risking their health because the work simply couldn't wait. Farm accidents were common and often fatal. Homemade tools broke and caused injuries. Animals panicked and trampled their handlers. Even successful harvests could turn deadly. Numerous farmers died when they fell into grain storage bins and suffocated in the loose grain, or when poorly constructed storage buildings collapsed under the weight of their contents. The isolation of frontier farms took a heavy psychological toll. Neighbors might be miles away, visited only occasionally. Women in particular suffered from this isolation, some going months without speaking to anyone outside their immediate family. Depression, anxiety, and what was then called prairie madness affected many settlers, sometimes leading to abandonment of homesteads or suicide. For those who persevered through these challenges and actually produced crops, economic obstacles remained. Transportation to markets was difficult and expensive. Without refrigeration, perishable products had to be sold quickly or preserved. Large agricultural corporations and railroad companies used their influence to keep crop prices low and transportation costs high, squeezing independent farmers from both directions. By the 1870s, another option was emerging on the frontier: working for wages in the growing towns and industries. Perhaps this offered a safer, more stable path than the high-risk ventures of mining, ranching, or farming. Wage labor did avoid some of the worst physical dangers and financial risks of independent enterprises, but introduced its own hardships. Industrial safety standards were virtually non-existent. Workers in frontier factories, mills, and workshops suffered horrific injuries from unguarded machinery. Construction workers built increasingly tall structures without harnesses or safety equipment, leading to frequent fatal falls. Railroad work was particularly dangerous. Track layers worked with minimal equipment under brutal conditions, suffering high rates of injury and death from accidents, heat stroke, and exhaustion. Chinese workers, who built much of the transcontinental railroad, were often assigned the most dangerous tasks, such as handling unstable explosives to blast through mountain passes. Working hours were long by modern standards, typically 10 to 12 hours per day, 6 days per week. Pay was low, with most workers barely earning subsistence wages. Child labor was common, with children as young as 8 or 9 working alongside adults in many industries, often suffering higher injury rates due to their size and inexperience. Workers had essentially no legal protections. Employers could fire people without cause, reduce wages arbitrarily, or withhold pay entirely. Those who complained or attempted to organize for better conditions faced blacklisting, being marked as troublemakers who no other employer in the region would hire. Company towns, settlements where a single employer owned all housing and businesses, were common in mining and lumber regions. Workers in these communities paid inflated prices at company stores, lived in company housing, and sometimes were paid in scrip company currency rather than legal tender. This created a form of debt bondage where workers could never save enough to escape the system. Whether you mined, ranched, farmed, or worked for wages, frontier life shaped your experiences in ways modern people would find disorienting. Perhaps most striking was the relationship with time, not the carefully measured minutes and hours of our digital age, but a more fluid reality governed by daylight, seasons, and natural rhythms. Without electric lighting, most people woke at dawn and slept shortly after sunset, their active hours expanding and contracting with the seasons. Work wasn't measured in 8-hour shifts, but by tasks that needed completion: fields plowed, cattle moved, or crops extracted. During harvest or roundup, people might work from first light until well after dark for weeks without a break. During winter, many rural workers had periods of relative inactivity when fields lay dormant or cattle needed minimal tending. The concept of punctuality, so central to modern life, had limited relevance on the frontier. With few clocks and limited need for precise timing in most activities, people operated on approximate schedules. Stagecoaches and later, trains introduced more precise timetables to the West. But outside these specific contexts, morning or after dinner were sufficiently specific time designations for most purposes. Entertainment and leisure looked nothing like their modern counterparts. After exhausting work days, most frontier folks had little energy for complex activities. Conversation around the fire, storytelling, or simple card games were common evening pastimes. Music was popular when instruments and skilled players were available, with fiddles, harmonicas, and guitars providing accompaniment for social dances. Reading material was precious and often shared among entire communities. A single book might be read aloud to gatherings of neighbors, or passed from family to family until it fell apart from use. Newspapers, when available, were read repeatedly, with every advertisement and notice scrutinized for information about the wider world. Organized sports existed, but in simpler forms than today. Baseball was gaining popularity, played with minimal equipment on makeshift fields. Horse racing, wrestling, and shooting competitions provided both entertainment and opportunities to demonstrate valuable skills. Children played games that required little or no equipment tag, hide and seek, and variations of stickball that could be played with found objects. Holidays and community celebrations took on great importance as rare opportunities for socializing and recreation. 4th of July celebrations might draw people from miles around for picnics, speeches, games, and dancing. Harvest festivals marked the successful completion of the year's most critical work. Religious holidays provided both spiritual meaning and welcome breaks from routine as the day draws to a close. You find yourself reflecting on the relentless challenges of frontier life. Every aspect required harder work, involved greater risk, and offered fewer comforts than its modern equivalent. The people who survived, and sometimes thrived in these conditions, possessed qualities that modern society rarely demands: extraordinary physical endurance, practical skills applicable to countless emergencies, and psychological resilience in the face of constant hardship and loss. The darkness gathers once more, and with it comes a silence profound enough to hear your own heartbeat. No car engines, no air conditioners, no electronic hums, just the whisper of wind, the chorus of insects, and the occasional call of night birds. This profound quiet, so alien to modern ears, was the soundtrack of frontier nights, sometimes comforting, sometimes unsettling in its emptiness. As you drift toward sleep, you wonder if you would have had what it took to survive here, not just for a day or a week, but for years and decades. The people who shaped the American West, for better and worse, were not the idealized heroes of later fiction, but complex individuals facing extraordinary challenges with the limited resources and knowledge of their time. Their story, stripped of romanticism, is one of human endurance against conditions that would break many of us today. The cool night air settles around you like a blanket, and the stars emerge in a display of brilliance impossible to see in our light-polluted modern world. This, at least, is one pure beauty the people of the frontier experience that few today can fully appreciate. The majestic sweep of the Milky Way across a truly dark sky, connecting them to the same cosmic panorama their ancestors had watched for countless generations. Morning arrives again in the Wild West, and with it comes hunger, a constant companion on the frontier. Food in the 1870s West bore little resemblance to the varied, convenient diet you're accustomed to in the modern world. Let's explore what keeping yourself fed would actually entail in this harsh environment. The good news is that game was still relatively plentiful in many areas. Deer, elk, rabbit, and various birds could supplement your diet if you had the skills to hunt them. The bad news? Hunting required ammunition, which was expensive and might be needed for protection. It also demanded time away from other essential work, making it a luxury many settlers couldn't afford during busy seasons. Most frontier families relied heavily on foods they could grow, preserve, or purchase in bulk. The staples of the frontier diet were beans, corn, and pork, dense in calories, but monotonous and nutritionally incomplete. Fresh fruits and vegetables were available only in season, a few months at most, and winter diets often contained no fresh produce whatsoever. This lack of dietary variety led to widespread nutritional deficiencies. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was common during winter and early spring, when no fresh produce was available. The symptoms: bleeding gums, loosening teeth, joint pain, and eventually death were well known, but difficult to prevent with available resources. Other deficiency diseases affected growth in children and caused various chronic health problems. In adults, food preservation was a constant challenge and critical survival skill. Without refrigeration, meat needed to be consumed quickly or preserved through smoking, salting, or drying. These methods deterred bacterial growth, but drastically changed flavors and textures while reducing nutritional value. The heavy salt content of preserved foods contributed to high blood pressure and other health issues. Women spent enormous amounts of time preserving food when it was abundant for use during scarce periods. Vegetables were pickled in vinegar or fermented. Fruits were dried or preserved with sugar if available. Root vegetables might be stored in root cellars' underground spaces that maintained cool temperatures. These preservation efforts were not optional activities, but essential survival work that could determine whether a family would eat during winter. Food storage presented its own problems. Properly prepared preserved foods could last months or even years, but improper techniques led to spoilage and potentially deadly food poisoning. Additionally, stored food attracted pests. Rats, mice, and insects consumed portions of most stored food supplies, and their droppings contaminated what remained. Most frontier families simply accepted a certain amount of insect parts and rodent droppings in their flour, beans, and other staples as unavoidable. Cooking itself was far more labor-intensive than modern people can easily comprehend. Meals were prepared over open hearths or wood-burning stoves that required constant attention and fuel. In wood-scarce prairie regions, women and children might spend hours gathering buffalo chips, dried manure, or twisted grass to burn as cooking fuel. Water had to be hauled from wells or streams, often hundreds of pounds per day for cooking, cleaning, and drinking. Even with these efforts, meals lacked the variety and flavor profiles modern people expect. Spices were expensive luxuries used sparingly, if at all. Sugar and coffee were treasured items, often hoarded for special occasions. Fresh milk was available only if a family kept a cow, and for only part of the year when the cow was producing. Most frontier children grew up with simple, repetitive diets that would horrify modern nutritionists. Interestingly, despite these limitations, obesity was rare on the frontier. The combination of limited food supplies, minimal sugar consumption, and constant physical labor kept most people lean. However, this leanness wasn't necessarily healthy. Many frontier folks suffered from malnutrition, even when they had sufficient calories to sustain their work. Beyond basic survival needs like food, frontier life presented unique challenges for families raising children. If you had been born in the West rather than just visiting it, your childhood would have been dramatically different from modern experiences. Childhood itself was conceived differently in the 19th century. Children as young as 6 or 7 were expected to contribute meaningful work to family survival, not as educational chores, but as essential economic contributions. Young children minded livestock, gathered eggs, picked vegetables, watched younger siblings, and helped with countless other tasks that freed adults for heavier work. By age 10 or 12, most frontier children worked alongside adults at nearly adult capacity. Boys followed fathers into fields, barns, or workshops, learning skills through direct participation rather than formal instruction. Girls worked with mothers, learning the complex domestic skills necessary for frontier homemaking, not simple housekeeping, but the production of essential goods like clothing, preserved food, candles, and soap. This early adulthood extended to other areas of life. Children were not sheltered from the harsh realities around them. They witnessed births, deaths, slaughtering of animals, and the sometimes violent conflicts of frontier communities. They were expected to understand and adapt to these realities rather than being protected from them. Education, as modern people understand it, was limited and inconsistent on the frontier. In established towns, schools might operate for a few months each year, typically during winter, when agricultural work was minimal. One teacher, often barely educated themselves, might be responsible for students ranging from 5 to 17 years old, all studying in a single room. Physical conditions in these schools were challenging. Buildings were poorly insulated, leading to freezing conditions in winter and stifling heat in warmer months. Supplies were minimal, perhaps a few shared textbooks, slates for writing that had to be constantly erased and reused, and minimal paper that was treated as a precious resource. Corporal punishment was the standard disciplinary approach, with whippings or beatings administered for infractions as minor as whispering or failing to memorize assigned material. In more remote areas, formal schooling might not exist at all. Some families conducted home education using whatever books were available, but many frontier children received only the most basic literacy and calculation skills, if that. There. Education focused instead on practical knowledge, how to predict weather, track animals, prepare soil for planting, treat common injuries, and perform the countless other tasks essential for survival. Child mortality remained devastatingly high throughout the frontier period. Approximately 1 in 4 children died before reaching adulthood, with the highest risk in the first 5 years of life. Diseases that modern medicine easily prevents or treats: measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, whooping cough routinely killed or permanently disabled young children. Accidents claimed many more, as child safety was a foreign concept in an era where survival demanded risk-taking. The psychological impact of this mortality on both children and parents is difficult for modern people to comprehend. Most children grew up watching siblings die. Parents expected to lose children and often gave the same name to a subsequent child if an older sibling died young, a practice that seems strange today, but reflected the different relationship with mortality in an era when death was an everyday presence. Perhaps nothing illustrates the gulf between frontier and modern life more clearly than approaches to health and medicine. If you became ill or injured in the 1870s West, your experience would bear almost no resemblance to modern healthcare. The first difference would be the absence of professional medical care in most situations. Doctors were scarce, with many communities having none at all. Those who did practice on the frontier often had minimal training, perhaps a brief apprenticeship or a few months at a medical college. Their knowledge reflected medical science of the era, which still relied heavily on theories like humoral balance that had more in common with medieval medicine than modern practice. Without access to professional care, most health issues were addressed through home remedies and folk medicine. Every community had people, usually women, known for their healing skills, drawing on traditions brought from various cultures. Some of these treatments, particularly herbal remedies, had genuine medicinal properties, but many were ineffective or actively harmful. Common medical treatments of the era included bloodletting, which weakened already ill patients, purgatives that caused severe diarrhea, supposedly to expel bad humors, and poultices of various substances applied to wounds, some of which introduced infection rather than preventing it. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was widely used for pain, leading to addiction in many cases. Mercury compounds were prescribed for numerous conditions despite their toxicity. Even when treatments had some validity, impure medications caused problems. Without pharmaceutical regulations or standardization, commercially sold medicines varied wildly in potency and often contained dangerous contaminants. Many patent medicines marketed as cure-alls contained primarily alcohol, providing temporary relief through intoxication rather than addressing underlying conditions. Surgery in frontier conditions was particularly horrific, without effective anesthesia beyond alcohol, whiskey, or opium. Patients endured excruciating pain during procedures. Sterilization was unknown or inconsistently practiced, leading to rampant post-surgical infections. Amputation was the standard treatment for serious limb injuries, performed with saws and knives that might be wiped clean but never properly sterilized. Childbirth represented perhaps the starkest contrast between frontier and modern medical experiences. Women typically gave birth at home attended by a midwife if one was available, or female relatives if not. Without prenatal care, many complications weren't identified until labor was underway. Breech births, hemorrhage, and other emergencies that modern medicine handles routinely often resulted in the death of mother, child, or both. Maternal mortality. Rates on the frontier were approximately 1 death per 100 births, more than 100 times higher than in developed countries today. Many women approached each pregnancy knowing it might be their last experience in life. Men's diaries and letters from the period frequently mention the heartbreaking reality of raising children alone after losing wives in childbirth. The combined impact of inadequate nutrition, constant physical strain, minimal preventive care, and primitive treatment options meant that frontier populations experienced health outcomes more similar to developing nations today than to modern America. Life expectancy at birth was under 40 years, with those surviving childhood likely to suffer chronic health problems by their 50s if they lived that long. Beyond these material hardships, frontier life imposed a form of isolation and disconnection that modern people accustomed to instant global communication would find almost unbearable. This isolation shaped frontier psychology and culture in profound ways. Communication with distant family or friends occurred at the speed of physical transportation. Letters took weeks or months to reach recipients, if they arrived at all. News traveled slowly and unreliably, often distorted through retelling. Major events might not become known in remote areas until months after they occurred. This information vacuum contributed to a highly localized worldview where distant events seemed abstract and irrelevant compared to immediate community concerns. The isolation was particularly difficult for those accustomed to more settled environments. Women who had grown up with close female friendships and family networks often found themselves alone for days or weeks, while husbands traveled for supplies or work. Their diaries frequently mentioned crippling loneliness and the psychological strain of having no adult conversation for extended periods. This isolation sometimes led to what contemporary accounts called prairie madness, severe depression, anxiety, and occasionally psychosis triggered by the combination of isolation, constant work, and environmental hardships. Some affected individuals became violent toward family members or committed suicide. Others simply abandoned their homesteads and returned east, unable to endure the psychological pressure of frontier life. Even in established communities, social connections were limited by practical constraints. Visiting neighbors might require traveling several miles, each way a significant undertaking, when time was precious and transportation limited to walking or horseback. Formal social gatherings were infrequent, typically centered around church services, seasonal celebrations, or community work events like barn raisings or harvest festivals. Churches played a crucial role in frontier communities beyond their spiritual function. They served as social hubs, educational centers, and mutual aid societies. Even those with limited religious conviction often participated in church activities for the community connection they provided. Religious leaders, ministers, priests, or lay preachers frequently took on roles far beyond religious guidance, serving as teachers, dispute mediators, and community organizers. The establishment of community institutions marked important milestones in frontier development. Building a school, church, or meeting hall represented a commitment to permanent settlement rather than temporary exploitation. These institutions helped transform mining camps or trading posts into towns with collective identities and shared futures. The creation of local governments, rudimentary as they often were, similarly marked transitions from frontier chaos to established community. Frontier communities also developed distinctive forms of mutual aid and collective action necessary for survival in harsh conditions. Barn raisings and house raisings allowed families to complete large construction projects impossible for individual households. Harvest teams moved from farm to farm, ensuring crops were gathered before weather could destroy them. Spontaneous search parties formed when children went missing. These cooperative traditions reflected the practical reality that no individual or family could survive the frontier entirely through self-reliance. This community interdependence existed alongside the individualism that later became mythologized. In frontier narratives, both elements were necessary responses to frontier conditions: self-reliance for daily survival, community cooperation for challenges beyond individual capacity. The tension between these values shaped frontier culture and continues to influence American attitudes toward government, community, and individual responsibility. As another day in the Wild West draws to a close, you find yourself contemplating a mental and emotional resilience required to endure such conditions year after year. The people who populated the American frontier weren't superhuman. They suffered, struggled, and sometimes broke under the relentless pressure of their environment. But many adapted and persevered, developing skills and perspectives that allowed them to find meaning and even joy amid hardship. The darkness settles around you once more, bringing with it the profound silence of the pre-industrial night. The day's experiences have given you a glimpse into a world both familiar and utterly alien. World where survival required constant vigilance, where comfort was rare and luxury almost non-existent, where death was an everyday companion rather than a distant stranger. As sleep approaches, you wonder about the people who chose this life or had it thrust upon them by circumstance. What drove them west? What sustained them through blizzards, droughts, illness, and loss? What would they think of the world their struggles helped create, a world of abundance and security beyond anything they could have imagined, built on foundations they laid through exhausting labor and countless sacrifices? The questions follow you into dreams filled with endless prairies, towering mountains, and the faces of those who tamed the Wild West, not through romantic gunfights, but through the quiet heroism of daily persistence against overwhelming odds. Their story, stripped of Hollywood glamour and frontier mythology, stands as a testament to human adaptability and the extraordinary courage of ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. Dawn breaks on what will be your final day in the Wild West. As the golden light spills across the landscape, you take a moment to appreciate the raw beauty that drew so many westward, despite the dangers and hardships. The frontier was a place of stunning natural grandeur: vast prairies rippling like oceans, mountains scraping the sky, canyons plunging into the earth's depths. This beauty, at least, wasn't a Hollywood invention. But even this relationship with the natural world differed profoundly from modern environmental perspectives. The frontier mentality viewed nature primarily as a resource to be conquered and exploited, rather than preserved or protected. Timber was cut without consideration for regeneration. Game was hunted to the edge of extinction in many regions. Streams were diverted, polluted, or destroyed for mining operations with no thought for downstream consequences. The near extinction of the American bison stands as perhaps the starkest example of this exploitative approach. In the 1700s, an estimated 30 to 60 million bison roamed North America. By 1884, fewer than 1,000 remained. This devastation wasn't simply the result of hunting for food or hides, though, that played a part. It was also deliberate policy, encouraged by the U.S. government as a way to deprive Plains Indian tribes of their primary resource, forcing them onto reservations. General Philip Sheridan, a key military leader in the Plains Indian Wars, reportedly stated, "Let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo is exterminated. It is the only way to bring lasting peace and allow civilization to advance." Whether or not he actually spoke these exact words, they accurately reflect government policy of the era. The destruction of the buffalo herds was environmental warfare designed to break indigenous resistance by eliminating their way of life. For Native American nations across the West, the expansion of white settlement represented an apocalypse, not just physical displacement, but the collapse of economic systems, spiritual practices, and cultural identities tied to specific landscapes and resources. While early interactions sometimes involved trade and cooperation, by the 1870s most indigenous groups faced stark choices: confinement on reservations, continued resistance against overwhelming odds, or cultural assimilation. The reservation system represented a form of cultural genocide. Native children were forcibly removed from families and sent to boarding schools designed to kill the Indian, save the man. As Captain Richard H. Pratt, founder of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, infamously stated, these children had their hair cut short, were forbidden from speaking their languages, practicing their religions, or maintaining their cultural identities. The intergenerational trauma from these policies continues to affect Native communities today. Armed resistance against American expansion almost invariably ended in defeat, though some groups maintained independence longer than others. The Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876, where combined Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho forces defeated Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's 7th Cavalry, represented one of the last major indigenous victories. The subsequent military campaigns against these tribes were marked by increasing brutality, including attacks on villages and the killing of women and children. The tragedy of this cultural collision was heightened by the fact that many Native nations had sophisticated agricultural systems, complex governance structures, and rich cultural traditions that could have offered valuable knowledge to European settlers. The different approaches to land use and ownership created fundamental misunderstandings. Many Native groups couldn't conceive of owning land any more than one could own the air or stars, making treaty negotiations over territory fundamentally problematic from the start. These cultural conflicts extended beyond Native-white relations. The West was extraordinarily diverse, with communities from around the world bringing different languages, religions, customs, and approaches to frontier life. This diversity was both a strength, introducing varied skills and perspectives, and a source of tension in communities struggling with scarce resources and limited infrastructure. Chinese immigrants, who played crucial roles in building the Transcontinental Railroad and developing mining operations, faced particularly severe discrimination. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first major American law restricting immigration based on nationality, grew from anti-Chinese sentiment that had festered for decades in Western territories. Chinese miners were frequently driven from productive claims through violence or unjust application of foreign miners' taxes. Chinese communities in frontier towns often faced riots and mass expulsions when economic conditions deteriorated. Mexican Americans, many of whom had become U.S. citizens through territorial acquisition rather than immigration, similarly faced discrimination and displacement. Despite treaty guarantees protecting property rights following the Mexican-American War, many Mexican landowners saw their holdings taken through legal manipulation, intimidation, or outright fraud. Spanish-derived water rights systems that had functioned effectively for generations were replaced with English common law approaches less suited to arid environments. Even European immigrants found that national and religious identities continued to matter on the frontier. Irish Catholics, German Lutherans, Scandinavian Protestants, Eastern European Jews, each group tended to establish distinct communities and maintained cultural practices from their homelands. These communities provided mutual support, but sometimes became targets for nativist sentiment when economic or social tensions arose. African Americans who moved west after the Civil War hoped to find freedom from Southern oppression, but often encountered different forms of discrimination. Black cowboys, who made up approximately 25% of the workforce on some cattle operations, rarely received recognition in contemporary accounts or later mythology. Black homesteaders established communities in several Western territories, but frequently faced organized resistance from white neighbors and discriminatory application of homestead laws. The collision of these diverse groups, each with their own values, practices, and expectations, created frontier communities far more complex and conflict-ridden than later romantic depictions would suggest. The melting pot metaphor popularized in later American mythology obscured both the persistent cultural distinctiveness of various groups and the power imbalances that determined whose cultures would be preserved and whose would be suppressed. As the day progresses, you find yourself in a frontier town undergoing rapid transformation, a transition happening across the West during the 1870s and 1880s. The initial phase of settlement, characterized by individual prospectors, independent farmers, and small-scale enterprises, was giving way to more organized corporate development of Western resources. The arrival of railroads catalyzed this transition. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, dramatically reduced travel time between East and West from months to days. Subsequent branch lines penetrated previously isolated regions, connecting them to national markets and supply chains. This transportation revolution allowed large-scale extraction of Western resources for Eastern factories and enabled mass-produced Eastern goods to flood Western markets. These economic connections accelerated the integration of Western regions into national systems, but often disadvantaged small producers. Independent miners couldn't compete with large mining corporations that brought industrial methods and capital investment. Family farms struggled against agricultural enterprises operating on vast acreage. Small ranches found themselves squeezed by cattle companies with investor backing and political connections. Corporate interests increasingly dominated political as well as economic structures. Railroad companies, mining conglomerates, timber interests, and large landholders exercised enormous influence over territorial and early state governments. Water rights, mineral claims, grazing access, and timber concessions were allocated through processes that typically favored those with financial and political power rather than small operators or community interests. This transition from frontier to integrated region wasn't simply economic, but cultural. The rough-edged mining camp or cattle town gradually acquired institutions that signaled permanence and connection to wider society banks. Schools, churches, newspapers, theaters, and fraternal organizations. Streets were surveyed and sometimes paved. Wooden structures were replaced with brick and stone buildings. Local governments enacted ordinances regulating behavior that had previously gone ungoverned. For many who had been attracted to the frontier, precisely because of its freedom from Eastern constraints, these changes represented unwelcome domestication of the wild spaces they had sought. Some continually moved westward ahead of advancing civilization, seeking new frontiers. Others struggled to adapt to increasing regulation, competition, and social expectations. The mythological end of the frontier, declared in the 1890 census, represented real psychological and cultural challenges for those whose identities were tied to frontier conditions. That part of this transformation involved the taming, or at least management, of frontier violence. The iconic gunfighters and outlaws, who would later dominate Western mythology, operated in a specific historical window when formal law enforcement was establishing itself against pre-existing systems of personal and community violence. By the 1880s and 1890s, professional police forces and court systems had replaced vigilante justice in most established communities, though remote areas still saw occasional eruptions of frontier-style conflict resolution. The legendary figures who captured public imagination wild: Bill Hickok, Wyatt Earp, Billy the Kid, Jesse James operated in this transitional period, often moving back and forth between legal and illegal activities as circumstances changed. Their later mythologization obscured the complex, often morally ambiguous reality of their lives. Hickok, far from the perfect marksman of legend, shot bystanders in at least 2 gunfights. Earp worked variously as a lawman, gambler, brothel keeper, and vigilante across his career. The Robin Hood image attached to Jesse James ignored his Confederate guerrilla background and the innocent victims of his robberies. As evening approaches on your final day in the Wild West, you find yourself contemplating the gap between frontier reality and the mythology that would later emerge from it. Why did Americans and eventually the world become so fascinated with a romanticized version of this brutal period? What needs did these myths serve, and what truths did they obscure? Part of the answer lies in timing. The most intense period of frontier mythology making occurred precisely as the actual frontier was disappearing. The Wild West shows of Buffalo Bill Cody began in the 1880s, featuring staged reenactments of Indian battles and stagecoach robberies for Eastern audiences, even as railroads, telegraph lines, and formal governance were integrating Western regions into mainstream American society. These performances weren't meant as accurate historical recreations, but as entertainment that resonated with Eastern ideas about the West, the dime novels that popularized exaggerated tales of Western heroes originated not on the frontier, but in Eastern publishing houses written by authors who rarely had first-hand experience of the regions they described. These formulaic stories emphasized action, clear moral distinctions between heroes and villains, and a vision of the West as a testing ground for American virtues of self-reliance, courage, and individualism. Later, Hollywood Westerns further refined and amplified these mythological elements, creating iconic images of lone cowboys, heroic sheriffs, dastardly outlaws, and savage Indians that bore little resemblance to historical reality. These films served psychological and cultural functions beyond entertainment. They offered reassuring narratives about American identity during periods of rapid social change and international challenges. The mythology suggested that American character had been forged in frontier conditions, producing exceptional qualities that distinguished the nation from older societies. It implied that American expansion across the continent had been not just inevitable, but morally justified, a triumph of civilization over wilderness and progress over primitive cultures. It presented simplified moral frameworks, where good invariably triumphed over evil through righteous violence, justifying America's growing military and economic power on the world stage. What these myths obscured was the complex, morally ambiguous reality of Western development, the genocide of indigenous peoples, the exploitation of immigrant labor, the environmental devastation, the corporate manipulation of political systems, and the deeply divided communities struggling with fundamental questions about identity, governance, and resources. The real West offered no simple moral lessons, but rather a case study in how human societies adapt to challenging conditions, sometimes showing remarkable cooperation and creativity, sometimes descending into exploitation and brutality. As darkness falls once more, you reflect on your brief journey through the unromanticized Wild West. You've experienced firsthand why the average person today, accustomed to abundant food, medical care, physical safety, and countless comforts unknown to frontier dwellers, likely not survive even a single day in the actual conditions of the 1870s frontier. The skills, knowledge, physical conditioning, and psychological resilience required for frontier survival represent a way of life so distant from modern experience as to be almost unimaginable. Yet something about this world continues to fascinate us. Perhaps it's the raw honesty of a life, stripped to essentials, where tasks have immediate consequences and achievements represent tangible victories against natural constraints. Perhaps it's the community interdependence that emerged from shared challenges, creating connections that transcended differences in background or belief. Perhaps it's simply the reminder that human beings can endure and even find meaning in conditions far harsher than most of us will ever face. The legacy of the American frontier extends beyond mythology into the actual structures and systems that shape modern American life. Property laws, water rights frameworks, federal-state relationships, approaches to natural resources, and countless other aspects of American governance emerged from frontier-era compromises and conflicts. The diversity of Western communities, despite efforts at forced assimilation, contributed to the multicultural reality of modern America. Even the continuing tensions between individual rights and collective welfare, local control and national standards, exploitation and conservation have roots in frontier-era debates. For indigenous peoples, the frontier era represents not a glorious chapter in national expansion, but the devastation of ancient lifeways and the beginning of a long struggle for cultural survival and sovereignty that continues today. Their perspective reminds us that the simple, triumphalist narrative of Western settlement ignores the complex civilizations that already existed and the incalculable knowledge lost through their disruption. The most accurate understanding of the frontier requires holding multiple perspectives, simultaneously acknowledging both the courage of those who built new communities in challenging conditions and the devastation experienced by those displaced by this expansion. As you drift toward sleep on your final night in the Wild West, the sounds of this earlier America surround you, the whisper of wind through prairie grass, the distant howl of coyotes, perhaps the faint piano notes from a saloon down the street. These sensory experiences, at least, connected all who lived through this era, regardless of background or circumstance. The vast skies, extreme weather, imposing landscapes, and profound silences shaped everyone who encountered them, creating a shared relationship with the environment, even amid cultural conflicts. Tomorrow, you'll return to your own time, carrying with you a deeper understanding of this pivotal period in American history. You'll never again see a Western film or read a frontier novel without recognizing the sanitized, simplified version of a complex reality. You'll appreciate the extraordinary comfort and security of modern life, achieved through technological advances unimaginable to frontier dwellers. You might find yourself more aware of the skills and knowledge lost in the transition to our specialized, technology-dependent society, the practical self-sufficiency that allowed frontier people to build, repair, grow, preserve, and create what they needed with minimal outside support. Most importantly, you'll understand that the real story of the American West isn't found in gunfights and gold strikes, but in the daily struggles of ordinary people, men, women, and children of diverse backgrounds who faced extraordinary challenges with the limited resources available to them. Their story, without Hollywood embellishment, contains enough genuine courage, tragedy, innovation, conflict, cooperation, cruelty, and kindness to fill countless histories. Their legacy lives in the communities they established, the environmental changes they initiated, the cultural patterns they created, and the myths that grew from their experiences. The real Wild West disappeared long ago, transformed by technology, population growth, economic integration, and environmental change into the modern American West of cities, suburbs, highways, and managed landscapes. Yet echoes of frontier experience persist in regional identities, local traditions, land use patterns, and governance structures. The memory of this formative period continues to influence how Americans understand themselves and their nation's development, even as scholars and communities work to replace simplistic mythology with more accurate, inclusive understandings of this complex history. As you finally surrender to sleep, the boundary between past and present seems to blur. The challenges faced by frontier communities adapting to environmental constraints, managing scarce resources, building functional communities among diverse populations. Balancing individual freedom with collective needs remain relevant in sound. New forms today. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the frontier experience is not a set of answers, but a collection of questions about human adaptation, community formation, and the relationship between people and the natural world. Questions each generation must answer anew as circumstances change. The stars shine brilliantly above. The same stars that guided travelers across the prairie, helped farmers time their planting, and gave comfort to homesick immigrants far from familiar landscapes. In this moment of connection across time, you feel a fleeting kinship with those who looked upon these same constellations a century and a half ago, wondering what tomorrow would bring in a world where survival was never guaranteed, but life, in all its harshness and beauty, was experienced with intensity seldom matched in our more comfortable era. Sleep comes at last, and with it dreams of a West both harsh and magnificent, a place where human vulnerability and resilience were displayed in equal measure, where diverse peoples collided and sometimes cooperated in ways that would shape a nation, and where the daily struggle for existence contained moments of transcendent connection with landscapes of breathtaking grandeur. The real Wild West, stripped of romantic illusion, offers a window into human experience at its most elemental, challenging, frightening, and occasionally sublime. As the sky darkens and the first drops of rain begin to fall, you turn back toward your cabin, the wind pushing at your back. Along the trail, you pass a group of men trudging toward the mine, their faces shadowed by exhaustion, their boots heavy with mud. There's no glory in their walk, only the quiet understanding that another day underground is another day tempting fate. Mining in the 19th century wasn't a job. It was a gamble with death. Beneath the surface, tunnels collapsed without warning, swallowing men whole. Toxic gases crept through narrow shafts, suffocating the unaware. Blasting powder, unstable and unpredictable, could detonate too soon, tearing limbs apart. And even if you made it out alive, the damage stayed with you, lungs blackened by coal dust, bodies poisoned by mercury from gold refining, a slow, silent decay that followed you long after the last shift. But even if you avoided the mines, no frontier trade was truly safe. Farming meant wrestling with heavy, unguarded machinery that could crush a hand in an instant. Ranching meant handling animals hundreds of pounds heavier than you, capable of kicking or trampling without warning. And logging? That was one of the deadliest jobs of the era, chains of falling trees, swinging axes, and snapped cables turning forests into graveyards. Simply earning a living out here meant living on the edge of disaster, where the risk of injury or death dwarfed anything most people today could imagine. You reach your cabin just as the storm breaks. Rain pours through cracks in the roof, and you scramble to place buckets in the growing puddles. Water drips into every corner, but you don't curse it, you collect it. Clean water was a luxury. Many settlers drank from rivers shared with livestock and laundry, unknowingly swallowing cholera, dysentery, or typhoid. A single sip could mean a fever by nightfall, death by morning. Sitting in the dim light, listening to the rhythm of rain on wood, you realize how far the myth of the Wild West strays from reality. There were no white hats or black hats, no dramatic showdowns at high noon. Just people exhausted, scared, determined, trying to survive in a world that offered no guarantees. The fact that so many did survive is not luck. It's a testament to grit, to resilience, to the quiet strength of those who refuse to break. Night falls fast when there's no electricity. You light a candle and an oil lamp, handling each flame like a live snake. Fire could destroy everything in minutes. A spark on dry wood, a tipped lantern, entire towns had burned to ash from a single mistake. There were no fire departments, no sirens, no help coming. You lie down a lumpy mattress your body aching from a single day of frontier labor. Your stomach churns from food that tasted strange, preserved with methods you don't fully trust. Your mind races, still on edge, because out here, a moment of carelessness can cost you everything. As sleep pulls you under, you wonder, will you wake up tomorrow? Or will your name join the countless others lost to fever, accident, or exposure? Another forgotten soul in the brutal story of westward expansion. The wind howls outside, a lonely sound that echoes across the endless dark. And if you do see the sun again, it won't bring relief, just another day of the same relentless struggle. In the Wild West, survival wasn't given. It was taken. Inch by inch, breath by breath, through hardship most modern lives never touch. Dawn comes slowly, light seeping through the cracks in the walls. You wake stiff and sore, muscles protesting after a night on a hard bed. But there's no time to rest. The frontier doesn't care how tired you are. You rise knowing today could bring anything new: work, a journey, a crisis. Let's say you decide to travel. Maybe to a nearby town, maybe farther west. In the 1870s, movement wasn't convenience, it was endurance. Yes, the Transcontinental Railroad existed by then, stitching the coasts together. But unless you had money, it wasn't for you. Most people traveled by horse, wagon, or foot. If you owned a horse, you were among the fortunate. These animals cost months of wages, and keeping them fed, shod, and healthy was a constant burden. And riding? It wasn't freedom, it was punishment. Saddles were built for function, not comfort, and hours in the seat left even seasoned riders blistered and broken. One startled leap from a snake or gunshot, and you could be thrown, left with a broken leg miles from help, or worse. Without a horse, the wagon was your only option. Forget the heroic images of families singing on sunlit plains. Wagon travel was agony. No suspension, no cushion. Every bump in the dirt road jolted your spine like a hammer. People vomited from the constant jolting, a condition called wagon sickness. Roads were just ruts carved by earlier travelers, turning into deep mud after rain or choking dust clouds in dry heat. Breakdowns were inevitable. Wheels cracked, axles snapped, and repairs meant waiting days for a blacksmith who might not even exist nearby. Now imagine going all the way west, joining a wagon train on the Oregon Trail. 2,000 miles of wilderness, desert, rivers, and mountains. Of the 400,000 who tried it, 1 in 10 never made it. Some historians say there was a grave every 350 feet along the route to Tombstone for every few steps, mile after mile. Crosses marked the dead, many unnamed, as families buried children, spouses, parents, and kept walking. Because stopping meant dying in the snow. Disease was the true killer. Cholera struck without warning, violent vomiting, crippling diarrhea, dehydration so fast a healthy man could be dead by evening. No cure, no real medicine, just prayers and panic. Dysentery, typhoid, mountain fever each took their toll. Children died in their mother's arms. Crossing rivers was another nightmare. Wagons didn't float, so pioneers turned them into rafts. Many capsized, people drowned. Livestock vanished into the current. Supplies were lost. The Platte, Snake, and Columbia rivers claimed hundreds. And contrary to myth, attacks by Native Americans were rare. Most tribes helped travelers, offering guidance and supplies. Most deaths came from accidents, crushed by wheels, kicked by oxen, or guns firing by mistake. The mental toll was just as deadly. Grieving was a luxury. You buried your child and kept moving. The stress broke people. Some took their own lives. And if you survived the journey, you often arrived with nothing: no money, no food, no strength, only to face a new life of backbreaking labor. Even short trips held danger. Bandits targeted the isolated. Flash floods swept away trails. Summer heat killed through dehydration. Winter storms trapped travelers, leading to starvation and desperation, like the Donner Party, who resorted to cannibalism to survive. Navigation was guesswork. Maps were crude, landmarks shifted, guides made mistakes. Get lost, and you might never be found. As you travel, you notice something the movies never show. The West was never just white cowboys. It was a mosaic. Chinese laborers built the railroads, worked the mines, ran shops. Mexican families had lived in the Southwest for generations before borders changed. Black cowboys made up a quarter of ranch hands in some areas. Germans, Irish, Scandinavians, Italians all brought their lives west. And of course, dozens of native nations had been here for millennia. But diversity didn't mean fairness. Racism was everywhere. Chinese workers got the worst jobs and lowest pay. Mexicans lost land through legal tricks. Black settlers, though vital to frontier life, faced discrimination and exclusion. For native peoples, westward expansion was a catastrophe. From 15 million to under 300,000 in a century wiped out by disease, war, starvation, and the deliberate slaughter of the buffalo, their lifeline. The U.S. government forced tribes onto barren reservations, broke treaties, and stole land. Children were taken to boarding schools to erase their language, culture, and identity under the slogan, "Kill the Indian, save the man." The cowboy versus Indian stories? Mostly fiction. Most conflict came from broken promises, not inherent hostility. Women's lives were nothing like the movies either. No damsels in distress. These were warriors in skirts. They worked before sunrise and long after dark, cooking, farming, delivering babies, defending homes with rifles. Many became widows young and ran entire homesteads alone. Yet they had no rights, couldn't vote, own property if married, or keep custody of their children. Domestic abuse was ignored. Single women had few options: teach for low pay, quit when married, or work in a brothel. Soiled doves often entered the trade out of desperation, widowed, abandoned, broke. Many suffered abuse, addiction, disease. Even those who earned money were shunned. Still, some found freedom here. The shortage of women gave them leverage. Wyoming and Utah granted women the vote decades before the rest of the country. Law enforcement? It was patchy at best. Sheriffs covered thousands of square miles often, the only law for hundreds of miles. They relied on posses, groups of ordinary men called to track down outlaws. Town marshals kept order in settlements, but the job was dangerous and poorly paid. Federal marshals existed, but were few. Vigilante justice was common. Sometimes it brought order. Often it brought mob violence. The famous gunfights? Rare. Most violence was messy, drunken, impulsive bar fights, land disputes, jealous rage. Punishment was harsh. Hanging for theft, murder, rape. Prisons were disease-ridden death traps. Many towns preferred quick executions. As night falls, you look for shelter. A hotel, if you're lucky. Don't expect comfort. Rooms were bare thin. Walls, creaky beds, bedbugs. Bathrooms were outhouses outside. You might share a bed with a stranger. Privacy didn't exist. For many, camping was cheaper. You wake to the raw chill of dawn, your breath visible in the dim light. The night's cold has seeped into your bones, and the fire from last night is nothing but ash. You're alive, another small victory. But the hunger is already there, sharp and insistent. Food on the frontier isn't a convenience. It's a daily battle. Breakfast won't be quick or easy. It'll be work chopping wood, lighting the stove, hauling water, all before a single bite is cooked. And what you eat won't be varied or balanced. It'll be beans, corn, maybe salt pork if you're lucky, day after day, month after month. The idea of a grocery store, of refrigeration, of fresh fruit in winter, those are fantasies from a world you've left behind. Out here, food is survival, not pleasure. And every meal is earned. If you're near forest or prairie, you might hunt a deer, a rabbit, some birds. But hunting isn't sport. It's risk and cost. Ammunition is expensive, and every bullet you fire is one less for protection. And time spent tracking game is time not spent building, planting, or repairing. For most, hunting is a supplement, not a staple. The real work of eating begins at home. Women often working before sunrise and long after dark spend hours preserving food when it's available, knowing that winter will bring months of scarcity. Vegetables are pickled in vinegar, fruits dried or stored in sugar if they can afford it, roots buried in cool cellars dug into the earth. Meat is salted, smoked, or hung to dry, its flavor lost to preservation, its nutrition diminished. But it will keep. That's what matters. Even then, nothing is guaranteed. A mistake in curing, a damp cellar, a rodent nest, and your winter food rots or poisons you. Rats and insects raid every storehouse. Most families accept that their flour has weevils, their beans carry droppings. It's not disgust they feel, it's resignation. This is the cost of staying alive. And the lack of fresh food takes its toll. Scurvy creeps in by late winter, gums bleeding, teeth loosening, joints aching. People know the cause. No vitamin C, but knowing doesn't help when the last apple was eaten months ago. Children grow stunted. Adults weaken. And still, the work never stops. Now, imagine you've decided to try your luck in the mines. The stories are everywhere, men striking it rich overnight, pulling gold nuggets from streams, becoming legends. But the truth is far darker. By the 1870s, the easy claims are gone. You'd have to stake your own, find unclaimed land with promise, register it, pay fees you can barely afford. Then comes the labor. If you're placer mining, you'll spend hours bent over icy streams, your hands cracked and bleeding, sifting through mud and gravel. After a full day, you might find a few specks worth pennies. Not wealth, barely survival. Or you go underground. Hard rock mining, that's where the real danger lives. You drill into unstable mountain rock with no engineering, no safety rails, no ventilation. Tunnels collapse without warning, men buried alive in seconds. The air is thick with carbon monoxide, odorless, invisible, stealing breath while you work. Blasting with black powder or dynamite is a game of chance. Charges go off early. Rocks fly like shrapnel. Men lose eyes, hands, lives. The noise is constant, deafening, leaving many stone-cold deaf by 30. And even if you survive the collapses, the gases, the explosions, your lungs will betray you. Silicosis sets in from breathing rock dust, a slow suffocation that turns every breath into agony. Mercury from gold processing eats at your mind tremors, confusion, madness. Copper, lead, arsenic, each ore brings its own poison. And there's no one to help when you fall, no workers' comp, no disability pay. Break your back, lose your hand, and your livelihood vanishes with it. And for what? Most miners don't get rich. They get tired. They get sick. They get paid $2 to $4 a day for 10 to 12 hours of hell. Storekeepers, bartenders, even prostitutes, many make more than the men whose sweat built the mining towns. And those towns? They're not glamorous. They're chaos. Packed with young single men, fueled by alcohol, violence, and desperation. A man might drink 3 times what a modern American does in a week every single day. Fights break out over nothing. Knives flash. Guns fire. And the filth is unbearable. No sewage systems. Waste piles in the streets. Flies swarm. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery spread like fire. In summer, the stench is so thick you taste it not. And if you do find gold, turning it into money is another trap. Many towns have no banks. You carry your dust, making you a target. Some saloons buy it, but they cheat you. Pay pennies on the dollar. Where banks exist, they're fragile. A single panic, and they collapse, wiping out life savings. Some are run by con men who vanish overnight with every deposit. Paper money? Worthless if the bank issuing it folds. Counterfeit bills are everywhere. The only real money is gold or silver coin, but carrying it is dangerous. Every step could be your last dot, so maybe you try ranching instead. The open range, the cattle drive sounds freer, healthier. But ranching is a gamble with nature. You need land, animals, equipment, all bought on credit. One drought, and your grass dies. One brutal winter, and your herd freezes or starves. In 1886 to 87, the Great Die-Up killed up to 90% of northern cattle. In a single season, disease spreads fast. Texas fever, anthrax, no cures, no vaccines. Wolves take calves. Rivers drown herds. And the drives? They're not adventures. They're grueling marshes. Cowboys work 20-hour days, sleeping in the saddle, guiding thousands of animals across rivers, deserts, storms. A stampede triggered by thunder, a coyote, a broken branch can turn 1,500-pound animals into a crushing wave. Men are trampled, bones shattered, lives erased in seconds. And the cowboys? Not heroes. They're kids, teenagers, often earning $30 a month for work that breaks bodies. Many are black, Mexican, or mixed race, pushed into this life by discrimination. Their food? Beans, salt pork, biscuits. No doctor, no rest. Many die young, from injury, illness, or violence. So you think maybe farming. At least you grow food. But farming on the frontier is a war against the land itself. The Homestead Act promised 160 acres free, but in the dry West, that's not enough to survive. Rain is scarce. Soil is tough. Prairie sod, held together by centuries of roots, resists. The plow. It can take a year just to break a few acres. Most families build sod houses, dark, damp, full of insects, leaking when it rains. And once you plant, nature attacks. Drought withers crops. Hail destroys them. Grasshoppers descend in swarms, eating everything plants, wood, leather. Frost kills harvests overnight. And if someone gets sick during planting or harvest, the farm starves. Women work just as hard plowing, harvesting, giving birth in the field, back to work in days. Isolation crushes the mind. Some women go months without seeing another soul. Prairie madness isn't a myth, it's real. Depression, hallucinations, suicide. And even if you harvest something, getting it to market is hard. Railroads and corporations control prices. You're paid pennies while they profit. And storing grain is dangerous. Men suffocate in silos. Buildings collapse under weight. Or maybe you skip the risks and take a wage job. Factory, railroad, mill, safer? Not really. No safety laws. Unguarded machines tear off limbs. Men fall from buildings with no harnesses. Railroad workers, especially Chinese laborers, blast through mountains with unstable dynamite, buried in avalanches, worked to death, 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Kids as young as 8 work beside adults, getting hurt more often. No rights, no voice. Complain, and you're blacklisted, no one will hire you. In company towns, you're paid in scrip, forced to shop at company stores, trapped in debt. You don't earn freedom. You earn survival. Time moves differently here. No clocks, no schedules. You wake with the sun, sleep when it sets. Work isn't measured in hours, it's measured in tasks. Plow the field, move the herd, mend the roof. In harvest season, you work until you collapse. In winter, you wait. Punctuality? A luxury. Morning or after dinner is precise enough. Entertainment is simple stories by the fire, a fiddle played at a dance, a book passed from hand to hand until it falls apart, baseball on a dirt field, horse races. Children play with sticks and stones. Holidays are sacred 4th of July, harvest festivals, Christmas rare chances to laugh, to dance, to remember you're human. And then night comes again. You sit in the silence. No engines. No screens. No hum of electricity. Just wind, crickets. The distant howl of a coyote. The stars so bright, so many, the Milky Way a river across the sky. A beauty most modern eyes will never see. But the silence isn't peaceful. It's heavy. It reminds you how alone you are. How fragile. How every day out here is a fight. You lie down, body aching, mind racing. Would you last? Not a day, not a week, but years? Decades? The people who did weren't heroes from a storybook. They were ordinary, broken, scared, determined. They didn't conquer the West. They endured it. And in doing so, they shaped a nation for better and for worse. Their legacy isn't in guns or gold. It's in the quiet strength of those who refused to break. A ford, and what little was available had to be hauled by hand from distant rivers or wells, often hundreds of pounds per day, carried in wooden buckets or metal pails that rusted with time, and once collected, it was never truly safe, because settlers drank from the same streams where livestock bathed, laundry was scrubbed, and waste was dumped, turning every sip into a gamble with cholera, dysentery, or typhoid, diseases that spread silently and killed swiftly, with no warning, no cure, and no mercy, and boiling water helped but required precious fuel, which in treeless prairies meant gathering buffalo chips, dried manure from bison herds, twisted grass, or sagebrush, all of which burned quickly and left behind a smoky residue that clung to clothes and hair. And even with fire, purification was inconsistent, so families lived with the constant threat of illness, especially in summer when heat accelerated bacterial growth and flies swarmed every surface, spreading disease from waste to food in seconds. And bathing was a rare and labor-intensive event, not a daily habit, because water was too valuable to waste on personal cleanliness. So most people washed only their hands, face, and feet, using a small basin and a rag, changing their undergarments only once a week if they were lucky. And full-body immersion happened maybe once a month in a metal tub placed near the stove, filled with water heated over hours, shared by the entire family in the same dirty water, one after the other, with the youngest going first and the adults last. And soap was not the soft, scented bars of today, but a harsh, lye-based mixture made from wood ash and animal fat, which burned sensitive skin and often left hands cracked and bleeding, especially in winter. And laundry was a full-day ordeal, done only once a week, starting before sunrise, with water heated in giant kettles over an open fire, clothes scrubbed on a washboard until fibers frayed, then rinsed in cold water and hung on lines to dry. But dust, wind, and smoke meant they were never truly clean, and freezing temperatures in winter made the fabric stiff and brittle, sometimes requiring breaking off ice before folding. And even then, clothes were rarely free of lice, fleas, or mold, especially in crowded sod houses, where dampness seeped through the walls and insects nested in the very earth that formed the roof. And toothbrushes were a rarity, so people cleaned their teeth with rags, salt, or twigs chewed into bristles, leading to rampant decay, abscesses, and tooth loss by age 30, and bad breath was common, not from poor habits, but from scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency that also made gums bleed and teeth loosen. A silent epidemic in winter, when no fresh fruits or vegetables were available, and children often went months eating only beans, corn, and salt pork, the three staples of the frontier diet, which provided calories but little else, creating widespread malnutrition despite full stomachs. Because variety was a myth, and fresh food was seasonal, available only for a few months a year, so preservation was not a skill, it was a necessity for survival, and women spent entire summers canning, drying, and salting everything they could grow or hunt, storing apples in sugar, turning peaches into leather-like strips, pickling cucumbers in vinegar, and burying root vegetables in cool, dark cellars dug into the ground to maintain a steady temperature, but even the best efforts could fail. A cracked jar, a damp storage room, a rodent nest, and spoiled food meant starvation in late winter, so families accepted weevils in flour, maggots in beans, and mouse droppings in grain as unavoidable parts of their meals. And meat was never refrigerated, so it had to be smoked over fires for days, salted in barrels, or dried into jerky, all of which stripped away flavor and nutrients while adding dangerous levels of sodium that contributed to high blood pressure and heart problems later in life. And cooking was a constant battle, done over open hearths or cast iron stoves that required constant fuel and attention, with no thermostats, no timers, no non-stick surfaces, so meals were often burnt on the outside and raw on the inside, and pots had to be scrubbed with sand or ash because soap was too valuable for dishes, and plates were reused without proper washing, increasing the risk of contamination, and milk, when available, spoiled within hours unless turned into butter or cheese, which required skill and time, and coffee and sugar were treasured luxuries, used sparingly and often reserved for Sundays or special occasions like births and funerals. And even basic spices like pepper or cinnamon were expensive imports that most families could not afford. So food was bland, repetitive, and physically taxing to produce, with every meal representing hours of labor long before it reached the table. From planting seeds to harvesting, preserving, hauling water, chopping wood, and cooking. And children as young as 6 were expected to help, gathering firewood, feeding animals, or watching younger siblings so parents could work. And by age 12, most were working full days alongside adults, with no concept of childhood as we know it. And education was limited to a few months a year in one-room schoolhouses where one teacher taught, every age from 5 to 17. With no textbooks, only slates that had to be erased and reused, and corporal punishment was common for even minor infractions. And in remote areas, there was no school at all, so learning meant survival skills like tracking animals, predicting weather, or treating snake bites with herbs, and medical care was almost non-existent, with doctors few and far between, often poorly trained, relying on outdated practices like bloodletting or purging that did more harm than good, and surgery was performed without anesthesia or sterilization, leading to infection and death. And childbirth was one of the deadliest events a woman could face, with a maternal mortality rate of 1 in 100, more than 100 times higher than today, and many women died giving birth, leaving husbands to raise children alone. And diseases like measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, and whooping cough killed 1 in 4 children before adulthood. And accidents were just as deadly, with no safety standards. So children drowned in wells, fell into grain silos, or were crushed by farm equipment. And mental health was ignored, with women especially suffering from what was called prairie madness severe, depression, anxiety, or psychosis caused by isolation, constant work, and lack of human connection, sometimes leading to suicide or abandonment of the homestead, and communities were miles apart. So visiting a neighbor meant a full day of travel on foot or horseback, and social events were rare, limited to church gatherings, barn raisings, or harvest festivals, which served as both work and recreation, and churches were more than places of worship. They were schools, meeting halls, and support networks. And even in towns, life was far from sanitary, with no sewage systems. So waste was dumped in the streets or in outhouses that contaminated water sources. And during rain, human excrement mixed with mud and flowed through camps and villages, spreading disease. And in mining towns, the stench was unbearable, with hundreds of men living in close quarters, drinking heavily, rarely bathing, and sleeping in crowded, vermin-infested rooms, and saloons had no toilets. So men urinated in alleys or behind buildings, and garbage piled up for weeks until someone burned it, creating thick, toxic smoke and epidemics of typhoid and dysentery swept through these towns regularly, killing dozens at a time. And the idea of personal hygiene, as we know, it didn't exist. Most people changed their clothes only when they wore out, bathed only when absolutely necessary, and brushed their teeth, if at all, with whatever was at hand. And lice and fleas were so common they were considered normal, especially in children, and bedding was rarely washed. So families slept on mattresses stuffed with straw or feathers that harbored bugs, mold, and mites, and even the wealthy had no advantage when it came to true cleanliness, because there were no germ theories yet, no understanding of bacteria, so even clean-looking water could be deadly. And doctors didn't wash their hands between patients, and wounds were treated with unsterilized cloths, and food was left out in the open, attracting flies and rodents, and the only real protection was isolation and luck, and women bore the brunt of maintaining any semblance of order, working from before dawn until after dusk, cooking, cleaning, preserving food, making soap and candles, sewing clothes, tending gardens, milking cows, and caring for the sick, all without help. And when they became pregnant, they often continued working in the fields until labor began, risking their health because the work could not stop, and if they died in childbirth, another woman in the community would take over their duties, and their children would be raised by relatives, and the cycle continued, generation after generation, with no end in sight. And yet, despite all this, people found ways to create comfort quilts, stitched from scraps, songs sung by firelight, stories passed down orally, dances held under the stars, and holidays celebrated with whatever food was available. And the lack of modern distractions meant that every meal, every clean shirt, every warm bath was an achievement, a victory over chaos. And the human body adapted, becoming stronger, more resilient, capable of enduring conditions that would break most people today. And children grew up with a deep understanding of life and death, seeing animals slaughtered, family members buried, and crops destroyed by hail or drought. And they learned early that survival depended on cooperation, not just individual. It was impossible to survive the frontier without understanding the relentless hunt for water, a daily quest that dictated where you lived, where you traveled, and whether you lived at all. Because water wasn't something you turned on with a tap, it was something you fought for, carried, guarded, and sometimes died for. And in the vast, arid stretches of the American West, clean, drinkable water was one of the rarest and most precious resources, more valuable than gold to a man dying of thirst, and finding it meant mastering the land in ways that no map or guide could fully teach, because rivers shifted, springs dried up, and what looked like a reliable source on one day could be a cracked mud flat the next. And the first rule of the West was this: never assume water is safe just because it's flowing, because a clear stream could be poisoned by upstream mining runoff, tainted with mercury or arsenic from gold and silver operations, or fouled by the carcass of a dead animal hidden just out of sight. And cholera, dysentery, and typhoid didn't. care if the water looked pure, they spread silently, killing within hours, so boiling was essential. But that required fuel, and in treeless plains, fuel meant buffalo chips or dried grass, both of which burned fast and left behind a bitter smoke that clung to clothes and hair. And even then, boiling didn't remove chemical contaminants, so many settlers drank their poison willingly, too exhausted or desperate to care. And the journey for water began at dawn, with women and children hauling wooden buckets or metal pails from wells, streams, or cisterns, walking miles each day just to collect enough for cooking, cleaning, and drinking, sometimes carrying hundreds of pounds in a single trip. And in drought seasons, that journey grew longer, deeper into unknown territory, where every step could lead to quicksand, rattlesnakes, or hostile encounters. And when rain did come, it was both a blessing and a danger, because flash floods could wipe out trails, drown livestock, and contaminate every stored supply with mud and debris, and collecting rainwater was. Skill roofs were angled to channel it into barrels or cisterns, but those containers were vulnerable to evaporation, contamination, and theft. So families guarded them like treasure, and in the desert, survival meant knowing where to find hidden sources, like seeps in canyon walls, dew collected on rocks at dawn, or moisture trapped in the roots of certain plants. And indigenous people knew these secrets, but they rarely shared them with settlers, not out of cruelty, but because every drop was a matter of life and death. And the U.S. cavalry learned the hard way that you couldn't chase Apache warriors across the Sonoran Desert, because the Apaches knew where the water was, and the soldiers did not. And many military campaigns failed not from lack of courage, but from lack of hydration, men collapsing, hallucinating, drinking their own urine in a final, desperate act. And even when water was found, storing it was a constant battle. Wooden barrels leaked, metal tanks rusted, and stagnant water bred mosquitoes that carried disease. So cisterns had to be cleaned regularly, a dangerous job that meant climbing inside dark, slippery pits where one misstep could mean drowning or being buried alive if the walls collapsed. And in towns, water systems were primitive wooden pipes, hand pumps, communal wells that served hundreds of people, often located dangerously close to outhouses or animal pens, guaranteeing contamination. And when a town's well went bad, the entire population could be wiped out in days. And there was no emergency response, no sanitation crews, no bottled water delivered to your door, just silence and graves, and the slow realization that the water you'd been drinking was killing you. And the search for water shaped every decision on the frontier, where you built your cabin, where you grazed your cattle, where you staked your mining claim. All of it depended on proximity to a reliable source. And when water disappeared, so did the town. Entire settlements abandoned overnight, their buildings left to rot in the sun, their wells dry and cracked. And some towns were built on false promises, their founders knowing the water wouldn't last, selling plots to unsuspecting immigrants before vanishing with the money. And in the mining camps, water was diverted from streams to power sluice boxes, leaving downstream communities with nothing. And when fights broke out over water rights, they didn't end with lawsuits, they ended with gunfire. Because on the frontier, water was worth killing for. And the men who controlled it, ranchers, miners, railroad barons, held more power than any sheriff or judge. And they defended their claims with armed guards, private militias, and sabotage, blowing up rival ditches, poisoning springs, and assassinating competitors under cover of night. And the idea of fair access was a myth, because the law of the West was not written in books, it was written in blood and dust. And a man who stole your water was not arrested, he was hunted. And when he was found, he was given no trial, only a rope and a tree. And the bodies of water thieves swung from cottonwoods across the frontier, a warning to others who might dare to take what wasn't theirs, And even in the most desperate moments, some held to a code sharing water with a stranded traveler, giving a drink to a dying man, because they knew that today's stranger could be tomorrow's savior, and that in a land where water was life, mercy was the closest thing to salvation. But mercy didn't last long when survival was at stake, and the same man who shared his canteen one day might shoot another for trying to drink from his well the next. Because the West didn't reward kindness, it rewarded strength and the ability to hold what was yours. And the duel, that most mythologized moment of the Wild West, was not the carefully choreographed showdown of Hollywood, but a sudden, brutal, often senseless act of violence born from pride, fear, or a single insult too many, and the image of two men facing off at high noon, hands hovering over their six-shooters, was largely a fiction, because most gunfights were chaotic, drunken brawls that erupted in saloons, not dusty streets. And the famous quick-draw duel was rare. Most men didn't die with their boots on in a fair fight. They died with their backs turned, shot in the dark, or caught in a crossfire during a robbery gone wrong. And the men who became legends, Wyatt Earp, Wild Bill Hickok, Doc Holliday, were not paragons of justice, but complex, often violent, figures who moved between law and outlaw, and their reputations were built less on heroism than on survival, because in a world where most gunmen died young, living into middle age was the greatest badge of honor, and the real duel was not between two men, but between a man and his own fear, because drawing your weapon meant accepting that you might die in the next 10 seconds. And the hand had to be steady, the mind clear, the trigger pulled without hesitation, and even the best shot could be undone by a nervous twitch, a misfire, or a bullet from an unseen third party, and the Colt Peacemaker, the revolver most associated with the West, was not a precision instrument. It was loud, inaccurate beyond 50 feet, and prone to jamming, and most men carried it loaded with only 5 rounds, because the 6th chamber was used to hold the percussion cap in earlier models, and reloading under fire was nearly impossible, so every shot counted, and the average gunfighter fired 3 to 5 times in a typical confrontation, often missing every target, and the idea of the fastest gun in the West was mostly propaganda, sold by dime novelists and showmen like Buffalo Bill Cody to entertain Eastern audiences who craved tales of lawless frontiers and heroic showdowns. And the truth was that most men who carried guns were not skilled marksmen. They were farmers, ranchers, miners, and laborers who had little training and even less discipline, and their weapons were used more for hunting and protection than for dueling. And when a confrontation did happen, it was rarely a formal challenge, but a sudden escalation of tension, a shove, a shouted insult, a glass thrown across a barroom, and then gunfire. And when the smoke cleared, there might be 2 dead men, or 3, or none, and the survivor might be hailed as a hero or hunted as a murderer, depending on who told the story. And the law in most frontier towns did not condone dueling. There were no sanctioned arenas, no seconds to negotiate terms, no code of honor like in the Old South, because the West was too raw, too chaotic for such formalities, and sheriffs and marshals arrested men for murder regardless of the circumstances. And the famous gunfight at the OK Corral was not a duel, but a planned confrontation between lawmen and outlaws that lasted 30 seconds and left 3 men dead. And Wyatt Earp didn't win because he was faster. He won because he was prepared, armed with a shotgun and a revolver, and willing to shoot first. And the myth of the fair fight was just that, a myth, because in reality, ambushes, sneak attacks, and multiple shooters were the norm, and a man who waited for his opponent to draw was usually already dead. And the aftermath of a gunfight was not glory, but trauma, legal trouble, and exile, because even if you were the law, killing another man left a mark, and towns didn't want known gunmen staying long, fearing more violence. So the fastest gun often became the loneliest man, drifting from town to town, always watching his back, never staying long enough to build a life. And the women of the West, so often portrayed as passive observers, were anything but, because they too lived with the threat of violence, and many learned to shoot as well as any man, defending their homes with rifles. You wait to the wait of another day on the frontier, a world where even the simplest act, like starting a fire, demands hours of labor. In the treeless plains, women and children spend precious daylight gathering buffalo chips or dried grass, the only fuel available. Every step, every breath is tied to survival. Water must be hauled from distant wells or streams, hundreds of pounds a day, just to cook, clean, and drink. And when you finally sit down to eat, the meal is the same as yesterday, and the day before. Beans, corn, salt pork. Spices are a luxury few can afford. Sugar and coffee are saved for Sundays, for births, for funerals, rare moments of sweetness in a life defined by scarcity. Fresh milk, only if you own a cow, and only part of the year. For children, food is repetitive, lacking in variety, often nutritionally hollow. Yet, oddly, obesity is almost unheard of. Not because of health trends, but because every calorie is burned by relentless physical work. Still, leanness doesn't mean health. Malnutrition is widespread. Bodies survive, but they weaken. Scurvy returns each winter. Children grow stunted. Adults age prematurely, their bodies worn down by effort, not time. And speaking of children, imagine growing up here. At 6 or 7, you're already working. Not chores, work. You tend livestock, gather eggs, watch siblings, haul water. By 12, you're expected to labor like an adult. Boys follow fathers into fields and barns, learning by doing. Girls work beside mothers, mastering skills that keep a household alive, preserving food, making soap, sewing clothes from scratch. There is no childhood as we know it, no protection from the world's harshness. You see animals slaughtered. You witness death in childbirth. You bury siblings before you've even learned to read. And reading? That's a privilege. In towns, school might last a few months a year, held in a single room where one underpaid teacher instructs children from 5 to 17. Textbooks are shared. Paper is reused. Slates are erased 100 times a day. Corporal punishment is standard: whippings for whispering, beatings for failing to memorize. In remote areas, there is no school at all. Education means learning to track animals, predict storms, or treat a snakebite with herbs. And even with all this effort, 1 in 4 children won't live to adulthood. Measles, diphtheria, whooping cough diseases we vaccinate against today kill, without mercy. Accidents are common. Safety is a concept born in comfort, not here. If you fall ill, medicine offers little hope. Doctors are rare, often poorly trained, relying on outdated theories like bloodletting or purging treatments that weaken the sick instead of healing them. Most care comes from folk healers, usually women, using remedies passed down through generations. Some work, many don't. Laudanum, an opium tincture, dulls pain but breeds addiction. Mercury is prescribed for everything, even as it poisons the body. Surgery is a horror performed without real anesthesia, with unsterilized tools. Amputations are common, infections rampant. Childbirth? A gamble with death. 1 in 100. Women don't survive it. Men write letters mourning wives lost in labor. Children grow up motherless. This is not trauma. It's daily life. And then there's the silence, the isolation. In a world of instant communication, imagine waiting months for a letter. News travels slowly, if at all. Major events might take years to reach you. Families go weeks without seeing another soul. Women, especially, suffer trapped in sod houses, speaking to no one but children, their minds fracturing under the weight of loneliness. They call it prairie madness, depression, hallucinations, even suicide. Some abandon their homes and walk east, unable to endure the emptiness. Yet from this isolation, community is born. Barns are raised together. Harvests are shared. When a child goes missing, the whole town searches. Churches become more than places of worship. They're schools, meeting halls, support networks. These bonds aren't romantic. They're necessary. No one survives the frontier alone. And still, the myth of the lone cowboy persists because it sells. But the truth is cooperation, not individualism. It's neighbors helping neighbors, not gunslingers riding into town. As the sun sets on this final day, you realize the frontier was never just a place. It was a collision of worlds. Chinese laborers build railroads, only to be driven out by riots and laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Mexican families, who lived here long before borders changed, lose their land through fraud and legal tricks. Black cowboys, making up a quarter of the ranch hands, are erased from history. Native nations, sophisticated, diverse, rooted in the land for millennia, are called savages and forced onto reservations. Their children are taken, their hair cut, their languages forbidden. The policy is clear. Kill the Indian, save the man. The buffalo, their lifeline, are slaughtered by the millions, not for food, but to break their spirit. From 30 million to fewer than 1,000 in a century. This isn't progress. It's destruction. And then the railroads come. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, changes everything. Travel that took months now takes days. Eastern. Goods flood the West. Big corporations move in, mining conglomerates, cattle barons, timber empires. Small miners, farmers, ranchers crushed. The frontier is no longer wild. It's being bought, sold, controlled. Towns grow. Wooden shacks become brick buildings. Saloons get pianos. The law arrives: sheriffs, courts, police. The era of the outlaw fades, replaced by bureaucracy, taxes, rules. The men who once lived by the gun Wyatt Earp, Wild Bill, Billy the Kid, become legends not in their time, but after. Because as the frontier dies, America needs a story. And so the myth is born. Dime novels, Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows. Later, Hollywood. Staged battles, heroic cowboys, savage Indians. A clear line between good and evil. But the real West had no such lines. It was messy. It was tragic. It was courageous. It was cruel. The people who lived it weren't heroes or villains. They were parents, workers, dreamers, survivors, trying to build something from nothing, often at the cost of others. As night falls, you sit beneath a sky so clear, the Milky Way spills like a river of light. No light pollution, no noise. Just wind, coyotes, and the distant echo of a saloon piano. You think about what this world has taught you, not about guns or gold, but about resilience, about the cost of survival, about the stories we tell and the ones we erase. And then you realize this isn't just history. It's a mirror. The questions they faced, how to live with scarcity, how to build community, how to balance freedom and responsibility, are still ours today. The frontier may be gone, but its echoes remain in our laws, our land, our identity. So as you prepare to return to your time, to your comforts, your safety, your abundance, remember this. The real Wild West wasn't won with a six-shooter. It was endured, day after day, by ordinary people who refused to break. This has been the unfiltered truth of the frontier. No myths, no glamour. Just reality. If you made it this far, you've seen a world few truly understand. But this isn't the end. Next time, We'll step into another forgotten chapter of History One, where survival meant more than strength, where courage came not from a gun, but from silence, from waiting, from enduring the unthinkable. A world of spies, secrets, and shadows. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and join me next time, because the past isn't dead. It's just waiting to be heard.